right. So today we're going to talk about Euthyphro.
That's correct. Yes.
Kick it off for us. Lead us in.
Yeah, extremely exciting starting on this project. So before we go into Euthyphro, it'll be important to talk a little bit about Plato and Socrates to kind of set up, why we're talking about Platonic dialogues. So just to give a little brief history of Plato, and this is not going to be like extremely accurate. So if someone's out there, researching Plato and finds some inaccuracies here, pardon me for that. But pretty much around 300 BC, I think, is when Plato was around. And he was a son of a statesman. His brother also was a very famous Athenian politician. Athens, very famously, was a democracy. And most of what we know today to be the foundations of a republic come from the Platonic dialogues and the foundations of what was the Athenian democracy. But, that wasn't the only democracy. There have been democracies before that. But nonetheless, I digress. Plato was a scholar and was the student of Socrates. And what is known is that when Socrates was indicted, which we'll talk about here in a second, what exactly happened, and was put to death by drinking hemlock, it affected Plato a lot and led him to then leave Athens, go study elsewhere, learn many different philosophies, come back and form the academy, which was one of the earliest universities. And many famous philosophers studied at the academy under the tutelage of Plato, Aristotle being one of them. Aristotle is considered to be the father of modern thought, essentially. And so Plato wrote several books. Plato's lucky in a way. I shouldn't say lucky. We are lucky that a lot of these books actually survived. And that's how we know so much about Plato. I don't think Plato was the only philosopher of import, just that his books stood the test of time and they lasted and they were preserved.
So Plato basically is a touchstone for Western philosophical thought.
Correct.
There were certainly philosophers that preceded Plato, but in terms of the influence on Western philosophical thought, most philosophers point to Plato as the originator and the propagator of the evolution of what we understand to be Western philosophical thought.
Correct. They say everything is a footnote to Plato.
Right, everything's a footnote to Plato.
So he wrote Platonic dialogues. They're called early, middle, and late. Early Platonic dialogues are what we'll be discussing today: Euthyphro, Apology, Credo, and then the middle, I think, are Republic, and then there are the late ones. And they all, or most of them, feature a character very prominently, and that character is based on Socrates. The character is Socrates, right. and he names Socrates in the early dialogues. But later on, he's called the Athenian stranger, and they're all thought to be based off of the real character of Socrates, who was Plato's mentor. So, tell us a little bit about
Socrates looms large, obviously, in the Platonic dialogues because Socrates was Plato's mentor, and he's also a character in these dialogues. And so there is some debate as to who actually Socrates was, but whether or not he existed doesn't matter. What matters more is the fact that he introduced the concept of rational inquiry in a way that had not been expressed or unpacked in a meaningful way. And so the role of Socrates in these dialogues is he is sort of the master inquisitor. He outlines a system of inquiry that leads the reader to contemplate the nature of their own thoughts and actions as it relates to their interactions with fellow human beings. Socrates was famously not particularly interested in the other philosophical domains at the time, which had to do with what you could call speculative science about the nature of the universe, or even necessarily math or geometry, which I should say Plato was very interested in geometry. In fact, he had a sign.
Physics.
I do remember this. He had a sign at the entrance to the academy that said, "Those who do not understand geometry should not walk through this door." So Plato had this idea of sort of the interconnected relationships between math and some of the other domains of philosophy. But Socrates famously was not concerned with the nature of scientific principles. He was almost obsessed with the human condition and understanding how humans interact with one another, why they interact with one another the way they do, and what would be the optimal way of interacting with one another. But at a level deeper than that, he was also fascinated with this idea of how is it that we know what we know, and why is it that we do what we do. And you could summarize Socrates' contribution to modern thought like this. He basically was somebody who realized that the first step in wisdom is to understand, to the extent that you can, every inch of the boundary between what you know and what you do not know. And so his first step in advancing his knowledge and his wisdom was to first understand the limits of his knowledge. So understanding what you're ignorant of is the first step toward wisdom. And that is a very Socratic ideal.
Yeah. So he was a real character. We know a lot about Socrates, whose parents were and what he did. He was he served as a hoplite in the Athenian army through the Peloponnesian War. The Athens and Sparta fought this very long war, and a hoplite actually has to is a heavy infantryman and has to procure his own armor and also has to own lands. So there was a time when Socrates was, in fact, had enough means to be a hoplite. And he was known to be somebody who could bear extreme weather, harsh winters, starvation. He would stand at his post for hours on end without eating. He had the tendencies, essentially. And then after that, when the Peloponnesian War came to an end, he started speaking up against the 30 tyrants, is what Athens was governed by after the war ended. And he was very vocal against them. And he was asked to perform certain duties as an Athenian citizen, which he refused because he didn't believe that those duties that he was asked to perform by the higher authority was the right thing to do. He bucked against the convention of the time, which was very dangerous at that time. And he was kind of a gadfly, like a thorn in the side of the 30. And even after the 30 tyrants were toppled, and the Athenian democracy was set up, he still kept on urging people, like you said, to question themselves about the things that matter the most to a rational being. That is interactions with other rational beings, and that is ethics. His biggest, obviously, he didn't think of it as ethics or metaphysics or epistemology back then, but what we know of ethics comes from Socrates, this interaction between human beings, and what is justice. That was his biggest question that he asked.
Right.
What is the nature of good? What's the nature of evil? And he didn't provide any answers necessarily, but he urged people to ask themselves whether they knew the answers to the question. So he would famously go up to politicians, artists,
mathematicians, poets,
anybody who was prominent,
right,
or even lay people. He would just accost them in the market. And he would ask them these questions, and people would be irritated by his questioning. Some of them would, come up with answers, and then he would break down those answers, and he would make the person realize that what they were saying is in fact incorrect. He would find counterpoints in their own arguments, and that is the Socratic method of discussion or inquiry.
Yeah, I mean, I think what he did consistently was demonstrate to people through his own argumentative style and his style of discourse. He would reveal to people the fact that they were unaware of what they didn't know.
That's correct.
And so that's a disturbing thought for most people. And so the reason he was considered a gadfly or the original contrarian is because he would scrutinize anybody to the same standard, whether he was talking to an influential politician or a well-regarded poet or a highly respected scholarly mathematician. Every single time he found that at the root of his inquiry, playing as somebody who was the eternal student, he would realize that fundamentally people had a hard time explaining why they knew what they knew, and they often revealed that they were unaware of what they didn't know, and yet they were still practicing in these fields, going about their daily lives, and doing what you could say was expected of them from societal convention or from dogma within the domains that they had learned, like poetry and mathematics. And so Socrates' contribution to Western thought is this: not to take anything for granted, to really unpack the rationale of the concepts, the conventions, the customs, the ideas that you have, because that is where you actually expand your ability to effectively navigate this world as it pertains to your interactions with other people, but just through your own thinking.
Yeah. So he was such a thorn in the side of regular folk.
Right.
Yeah, because he kept questioning them this way that eventually they end up getting tired of him. But, if you are just someone who goes around irritating people, you're not considered dangerous. But what actually folks started fearing Socrates was because a lot of young, influential people started actually following Socrates around because they liked the way he accosted people on the streets, and they would gather around him and listen to these exchanges. And he started having this big fan following. There's this gathering of his students.
Yeah.
And that's when people started noticing, because those students, folks like Plato, were very prominent, came from very prominent political families. And they were being influenced, quote unquote, by Socrates. That's when people started taking notice.
I mean,
of
you
Socrates.
could summarize it as he was at once popular and unpopular. He was popular amongst the young and the impressionable, and he was unpopular increasingly amongst the establishment because they viewed his inquiry essentially as a threat to their authoritative positions, and so he is wrongly accused and tried and. We'll get into the fate of Socrates later, but suffice to say that he essentially becomes a victim of social convention.
That's correct. Yeah. Okay, so that's pretty. I think it fits the introduction. I think there's obviously more to talk about, but I don't think it really pertains necessarily to Euthyphro. Right. So let's just talk about Euthyphro. So the setting of Euthyphro is that Socrates has been now indicted.
Right. Socrates has been called to appear in court.
Saying that this, and we'll talk about the charge laid against Socrates. And when he is in the court, he meets a religious scholar whose name is Euthyphro, and Socrates has a dialogue in Socratic fashion with Euthyphro,
right?
And so the main question at hand, like, what would you say is the main question at hand in the dialogue of Euthyphro?
Well, so the main question, there's a little bit of background to plug in, I think, before we get to the main question. So Socrates meets Euthyphro sort of at the steps of the courthouse is the way you can think of it, and asks Euthyphro what he's doing there. And Euthyphro explains to Socrates that, well, I'm here because I'm trying my own father for murder, which is, that's shocking news. And Socrates begins trying to understand the particulars of the situation behind all that. But suffice it to say, they arrive at a point where Socrates asks him, well, why is it that you're doing this? Meaning, what is your motivation for actually trying to convict your own father? And Euthyphro, and you could say in a quite prideful way, says, well, I'm doing what's pious. I'm doing what would please the gods. And that immediately triggers this line of inquiry from Socrates as far as, oh, really? So let's talk about piety. So tell me, what is pious? And then this leads into the question where Socrates asks, is the pious what is loved by the gods, or is what is loved by the gods pious? Now, there's a nuanced difference there,
Right.
but it's very important because it has to do with the origins of good or the origins of justice.
Correct. So is a thing good because of some intrinsic property of that thing, not because someone calls it good? Because they're two separate things.
Right.
A thing may not be good, but just because society or convention or a higher authority calls it good, we may consider it to be good. But if you take away the higher authority, then that thing may no longer have that property.
Right.
But something that has an intrinsic property of good stands the test that even if you take away the higher authority, it would still continue to be good.
Yeah.
So it is interesting though about Euthyphro, the indictment that he's actually in there accusing his father. Socrates is in there because he's been accused by society. In Euthyphro's case, I think it's important to this because someone could look at the dilemma in it, where Euthyphro has an indentured servant who murders a slave, and the indentured servant is then bound up by his father, and kind of imprisoned in a hole is what it said. And while the father is trying to figure out what to do with this indentured servant who's murdered the slave, in the meantime, the indentured servant dies because of cold and malnutrition. And so Euthyphro believes that his father is now a murderer, and so he's bringing him up in front of the court to be accused. And the reason why, when Socrates asks him, like, how do you know that you're doing the right thing? He says, well, this is about justice. An unjust act should not go unpunished. And he says that because if I were to let this go unpunished, then I am also guilty by association. So it's important to note that the reason why Euthyphro believes that he should do this is because he does not want to be tainted by what his father did.
Right.
There is no direct mention in Euthyphro, the dialogue, about that he believes that his father unjustly murdered the indentured servant, because someone could argue that his father didn't. His father was didn't actively commit the murder; it happened passively. But that's never brought up in the book. He's more concerned about the fact that he's going to be tainted, and that would make it impious for Euthyphro to not do anything about it.
Yeah.
Whereas in Socrates' case, so it's basically, if we go back to look at Euthyphro's case, I believe it is about injustice. He believes an injustice was committed, but his biggest concern is impiety. He believes that this act is impious, and that's why he needs to do something about it.
Right. So there's what this dialogue points out is a very pointed and difficult question for people to contemplate, which is, what is the source of morality? What is the source of good?
Correct, because justice, as opposed to piety, justice,
virtue, justice
points towards virtue.
What is the source of virtue? Is what is virtuous what is preferred by the gods, or is what is virtuous what is decided upon by God or the gods, or do the gods actively seek for virtuous behavior to happen? And there's a nuanced difference there, but it's a very important difference because it speaks to the origin of morality. So I think many people walk through life with an understanding that there is potentially a supernatural source that determines what is good and what is not good. But if that were the case, then that means that what is good has sort of an arbitrary flavor to it, meaning that it's whatever this supernatural being decided was good is good. And this supernatural being could have decided that murder was good, or that, letting your father go is the right thing to do. Or vice versa. If this supernatural being or this supernatural source of morality is bound by good, meaning that the supernatural entity or deity is actually seeking the good, well, then that means that there's something that precedes that supernatural source of this alleged, source of morality. So now the dialogue doesn't give you one answer one way or the other, but Socrates is being very ironic in his questions with Euthyphro as to the nature of the origins of virtue, the nature of the origins of justice.
Correct.
Because what he's doing is he's pointing out to Euthyphro the fact that he is acting in a way, again, just like we talked about earlier, that is remarkably uninformed. He has, in a way, no idea why he's doing what he's doing. He thinks he knows, but he actually doesn't.
Yeah, and that's true to Socratic form. So if just to kind of elaborate on what you just said, yes. So in Euthyphro's case, he believes an act is unjust because it is impious. So if you took piety out of the equation, he would not be concerned about what happened.
Right.
Is what is made to be understood. In case of Socrates, though, he is brought to trial by a guy called Meletus, and his charge is that he denounces the old gods and has invented new gods, and that means he's being impious. But their main concern is got nothing to do with impiety. Their main concern was injustice. They believed that Socrates is leading astray the young people, the politically savvy people, and going against the society. And so the charge was completely the other way around when it comes to Socrates in this question. So Socrates then goes on to Euthyphro and says, they are bringing this charge of impiety against me. And since you, Euthyphro, are a man of God, I think you know a lot more about this than me. I want to learn from you. This is how usually Socrates traps people, right? He calls them as, he says, you're wise, you know everything, I know nothing, educate me. Right. And then he starts asking questions to Euthyphro, and then Euthyphro keeps backtracking, going back and forth. I think it's a fascinating dialogue to read. It doesn't take long to read it. And you're right. The dialogue doesn't end with him, with the reader taking away that this is in fact what piety is. This is in fact what justice is. It just leads you down the path, and then you have to start walking and making your own steps.
Yeah, I mean, I guess the other way to put it simply is it does have some parallels with this idea of the might makes right. Does might make right, or are the ones that are mighty seeking what is right? And if they are seeking something above themselves, then how mighty are they? Which is what another way to think of it. Now, there is a context here that sort of prevents, I think, the dialogue from going further down the two sides of the dilemma. So the fact that there's multiple gods, it seems that Socrates and Euthyphro talk mostly about, is what's good what all the gods would agree is good, and what's bad, what all the gods would agree is bad.
Yeah, before we go there, though, because you're going to make a very good point here. So, because you're going to talk about polytheism versus monotheism in a way. Is that what you're going with?
Yeah.
That?
So what my point is that the fact that they're in a polytheistic society prevents them really from exploring the other question, which is the one we've hinted at, and it's the one that's implied by the dialogue of Euthyphro, which is. If there's something that if the good precedes the supernatural being that decides what's good, then how potent is this being, and is this being truly necessary for your
before we go there though, I think it's important to kind of see how they get to that that argument, because it's an important argument that Socrates makes. He says, if Eddie and Anish had an argument about a question that could be objectively answered. Like, I see 2 cars parked in your parking lot, and you see, no, I see 1. We can go out and we can count 1 and 2 and see who won, right? No one's going to argue about that. Once you see that there are 2 cars out there, you're not going to sit and hold on to your point, right? So, and if I say, how many gallons of fuel in my tank, and then we can go objectively measure, and there will be no problem there. So then where is it that folks actually have arguments? What are the topics which lead to arguments? So similarly, he says, okay, so why is that important? Because if he talks about the stories about the gods of their time, and how certain gods favored certain actions and other gods favored other actions. Like, if you look at Iliad and Odyssey, it's all about gods clashing against one another. And if both of those are gods, and one god thinks of one action is favorable, And then that action, it could be considered to be pious because it is approved by a god. And then there's another god who doesn't agree with that action.
Right.
So if the other god finds the same action unfavorable, then it's impious. So then how does a human decide which action is pious and which action is impious?
Right.
And so then the question then becomes, then if it was such an objectively measured thing, there'd be no contention there. But what if it is something to do? So then what are the questions that the gods will also have these issues about? Are these issues objective? No, they're not. They're subjective. And subjective about what? So he talks about things that are like good and evil, things that are just and unjust, things that are shameful or praiseworthy. These are the kind of things that even you and me would have conversations about. Because I mean, just to very simply state, like, very few people are going to say that an unjust act should go unpunished, right? There will be some who would say that. That's fine. But most people are going to say an unjust act should not go unpunished. But the issue is not about that. The issue is about whether that act is considered unjust.
Right.
And that is where you'll find different opinions, right?
Right.
And if one could rely on a higher authority saying this government believes this act to be unjust, like women's education. Like, there are countries in the world right now where it is against the law for women to be educated. Just imagine that. And in that country, educating a woman is considered to be unjust. It's unlawful, correct?
Right.
And then you have obviously countries where that's absolutely not the question at all. Women's education is education. There's no question, right?
Right.
So you have to rely on a higher authority to answer whether women should be educated, which is ridiculous. Whether a higher authority exists or not, education is a good. It should be provided to everybody, irrespective of the higher authority.
Right.
See, that's just a simple example to give.
Right. So there's all sorts of examples of that. But I would go back and say that the other thing that's worth noting too, Greek mythology is rife with examples of gods doing mischievous, unethical things. And so for them to have a discussion about what is pious and what is not was a bit more complicated because they were trying to sort of weave a balance between, the gods misbehaving and then the gods that were largely, quote unquote, behaving. And so what that did was it prevented them from really nailing down what could be considered pious in a way that was ubiquitously approved by all the gods. And it prevented them from really identifying what would be ubiquitously disapproved by all the gods. So in the time and space of Euthyphro, figuring out what's pious was very fraught just because of the nature of the gods that they were encountering. That's why most of the discussion has to do with the first part of the equation. So if what is pious, what is loved by the gods, which gods?
Which gods?
And which gods and now the gods behaving in accordance with this idea of what piety or what virtue is.
Correct.
And it seems largely that many of the gods were not. And so most of the discourse, the dialogue, is on that first half of the question. But I think if they had, again, here now I'm just sort of extrapolating, but if they had been in a monotheistic framework, that would have, I think, allowed more room to go into the second half of the equation. So meaning that if God is trying to do what is good, then that means that there's something that supersedes that, meaning that there is something else that God is bound by something good that is called good. And then how would you reconcile this idea of some omnipotent, all-knowing, supernatural source of ethics?
Well, I don't know necessarily if that would take away from that. I see what you mean, but
it doesn't take it away. But I just think because the second half of that discussion wasn't really explored. They spent so much time disentangling all the mischievous, but I don't issues with the gods that they were dealing with. That I don't think they were able to really look at the second side of that equation.
But see, Eddie, I don't see I think during that time I don't think there was a monotheistic religion around.
No, there wasn't. That's what I'm saying.
There was not. So I don't think that concept even existed.
I think the second half of that dilemma wasn't really fully explored.
But I don't think that second half of the dilemma necessarily is explored even by Socrates or Plato, because that would be then at that time considered impious or sacrilegious you know. So I don't think he ever brings it up. I don't think he brings up religion in that situation. Even in other Platonic dialogues, he's never brought that up.
Well, it's not explicitly brought up, but it's clear that that's the implication. I mean, anytime you do, like for example, if you do reading on Euthyphro dilemmas and things like that, it's almost always in the context of debates between atheism and religious ideas about the sources of morality and whether there's a rational source of morality or one that is founded on religious principles.
Yeah, so that argument I completely understand, because what Socrates is saying is that their way of religion, that having multiple gods, lends itself to rational thought among human beings. Because if the stories are ripe with gods behaving sometimes in a manner that is ethical and other times manners that are not, or having these contentions among themselves, that means humans cannot look at those examples and govern their lives based on that. They have to have their own internal moral compass.
Right.
So I think that is probably the more important takeaway.
They have to go by example and not by source, which is by example of the act performed by whatever god it was, and not so much by because, for example, Zeus did things that were untoward, immoral, and Zeus did things that were moral. And so you would have to focus on the act itself and not the actor if you wanted to use behavior of the gods as sort of a role modeling of ethical behavior.
But you cannot justify your action based on the fact that Zeus did it. That's what Euthyphro is trying to say.
Right, that's what I'm saying.
And I think you're saying the same thing.
I'm not making that case. I'm just sort of explaining why it would be why the dialogue focuses mostly on this issue, because there's so many gods. How are you going to decide what they all decide is pious?
Well, no. But again, the other thing that is here, he says that I'm indicting my father because Zeus did the same thing to his father, and his father did the same thing to him. And that's the reason why I need to do this to my father, because that's the pious thing to do, because the gods did it.
Right.
And then Socrates is like, well, some gods are going to do this, some gods are going to do something else. So, so how does one then, that's the reason why humans need to build a moral compass. But again, even if we move away from this concept of a supernatural being, even if you were to talk about society in the same way, if you come back to the question of higher education for women and the governments, right? The government is considered to be a higher authority. If you could be born in a country where women are considered second-class citizens, where they're not supposed to get educated, and you would think that that's the right thing to do.
Yeah. So it's
and so
there's definitely examples of this. So with this dialogue, really, it points out a structure, a concept, which is this idea of having a convention, meaning having a sense for what is the right thing to do, or what is expected of you in a particular situation. And this dialogue points to the need to ask why. And is it why? Is it this the expected thing to do because it's the right thing to do? Or is this the expected thing to do because this is what the convention is? And is the convention trying to align itself with virtue, which is the ideal situation? Or is the convention aligned with something else that may not be concerned with virtue at all? So the example that you bring up of societies where there's discrimination against the education of females, you would not say that social convention is aligned with virtue, but you can bring it down to even smaller levels. For example, like the one example that comes to mind within the realm of clinical research, for example, we're just coming out of we're still in the throes of the COVID pandemic. Different parts of the world are suffering terribly from this. And one of the clinical research ethical issues that came up recently, and I was in the audience for a debate about this, was looking at what are called human challenge trials. As a means to accelerate the development of the vaccine, they had ethical debates as to whether doing human challenge trials, which is where they actually deliberately inoculate individuals with the COVID vaccine and monitor them and use the information, the data they get from caring from those patients as to determine how effective the vaccine is and what the course and natural history of the disease is, whether that's even ethical. And what was interesting in that debate, the side that was arguing for the human challenge trial kept saying, well, this technical approach is endorsed by the FDA and the World Health Organization. That was their argument.
Yeah.
And immediately I thought of Euthyphro. Yeah. That may be true. I mean, it is true, but that doesn't make it right.
Right.
And so,
so
and it may indeed
saying,
be right, but the fact that it's endorsed by an authoritative entity is not what makes it right.
Correct.
It's the fact that, well, it does seem to be sound at an ethical and scientific standpoint, and it does seem to offer the promise of acceleration of vaccine development and therefore saving lives. But they were quick to point out that, well, this is endorsed by the FDA and WHO,
Correct.
and that seemed to be the central
Correct.
point of their argument. And I immediately thought, well, that's Euthyphro. That's
Correct.
sort of conventional thinking, right?
Correct.
This is like leaving it up to an authoritative fallacy.
Correct. That's what you're giving is an attribute of that particular property.
Right.
This is good because it is endorsed. Sorry, this is good and it is endorsed by society. This is good and it's endorsed by a religion. This is good and it's endorsed by a certain group.
Right.
It is not good because it is endorsed by him. That's just an attribute of that thing. It's just endorsed by these people. That doesn't make it good. What is the intrinsic property of that particular thing that makes it good? And you cannot, the qualifier cannot be because, this government says so, or this society says so, or this book says so. It has to be rationally thought. And when you come, and so with everything, when it comes to simple decisions that you make in your day-to-day, decision, like I need to take a big loan so that I can go to medical school. And why should one have to incur so much debt to go to medical school? Well, that's how medical education is. It's been decided that, good medical education is expensive, and that's the convention. That's the trend. So young people are expected to take all this loan and get in. But the reason to do it, if that was the reason to do it, because that was conventional, right? That is just an attribute of it. Is it truly the case that in order to be of use to participate in the common good, one has to go into debt?
Right. It's right. It's simply asking the question: is this the right thing? Right. Yes, this is what I'm being told. This is the signaling that I'm getting from society, or even from my own flawed thinking. And so it's that's the other important thing I would say you should take from reading the Socratic dialogues, which is the idea is to examine your own thinking. So they're giving you examples like Euthyphro, but as you astutely point out, when we read these, you're like, I'm Euthyphro. We are Euthyphro.
Yeah.
That's so, when you read this, it's not like, oh, Socrates, he's awesome. I see what he's doing. He's being ironic and he's pretending to be the student, but he's actually the teacher and all this stuff. But before you go jumping on, putting on Socrates' robes and being like, on Team Socrates, you must realize that you're Euthyphro.
That's correct.
That's the point of reading this dialogue, which is how much of your life is based purely on convention.
That's correct.
How much of your life is unexamined.
That's correct.
That's the point.
That's the point, man. Every decision we make, we have to ask ourselves, is this a good decision? It's good because of what?
Right.
Are we seeking someone's approval? Are we doing something because our boss said so? Or the administrator said so? Or the hospital, corporation said so? Or society? Or government? Or are we doing something because it is in fact the right thing to do? It is, even if these people didn't exist, would it still be the right thing to do? So the question that we asked each other, right? Our view generation. If Medicare reimbursement didn't exist,
we're swimming in deep waters here. We're talking about religion, we're talking about money, we're going after. But that's what philosophy does. It makes you face the big entities in your life and really look at them with a scrutinous eye, and unapologetic and relentless, because that's what intellectual discourse, that's what rational thinking demands.
Correct.
Putting things under the rug for yourself does no good.
And I think that's every decision in life can be made in the same terms. I want to buy this big house. Why? Is that because that's expected of me as a physician? Or that, if big houses, if this kind of houses didn't exist, would you actually go out of the way to kind of construct one like this? Would that be the right thing to do? Would that be good?
Yeah.
And you could actually look at every decision the same way. From private schooling for your kids to the vacations you're taking, or how you're spending your time, how you're spending your money, how much money you make. Right.
And so those questions as to the questions about is my decision, my action in this case, a virtuous one. You could ask that at every level, even the most mundane things, like what am I going to have for breakfast? But that's not really where it's useful. Where it's most useful is where Socrates found it to be, where he found the richness of the interactions that he had with folks, the arguments, the times when he had enjoyable discussions with his students, all had to do with the big things in life, meaning time, the scholarly endeavors that they pursued, the rules they used to govern the interactions within the groups and amongst individuals, friendship, the important things in life. That's where you want to sort of look at things through the lens of virtuous thinking and virtuous action.
In short, ethics. In short, what you're talking about is ethics, right? The big questions in life. But if you practice them, even on the smaller questions in life, you'll be able to practice some of the big questions in life.
Sure.
And therein lies the beauty of this test. This is the question. If the litmus test is this thing that I'm about to do, would it be the right thing to do if whatever higher authority that recommends it didn't exist? And fill in the blank. Is social media good? If this current way of society didn't exist, would social media be considered a good thing? Mm-hmm. And you can answer these questions. Mass media,
right?
Let's take it back to we just came to this.
But it would. I see your point, and I agree. But I think it would also be more useful in situations where you're trying to decide. For yourself.
Like, should I
post this on social media? And then you just start asking yourself, why? And why do I want to do that? And why do I want to do that? That is the Socratic approach, meaning you find out what is the underlying rationale behind what you're doing and identify your blind spots, identify what you don't know. And if you do that with the big questions in life, and even, I guess we could say the medium questions in life and even the small ones, but if you do that routinely, you're less likely to fall for things. You're less likely to do things out of a sense of, trying to be compliant with some
conventional. Trying to be conventional.
Right. You're less likely to be susceptible to conventions that may have flawed underpinnings. Right. And so this is why, in terms of wrapping this or interarticulating this with this idea of resiliency and internal fortitude, that's what you need. I mean, you need to have a moral compass. You need to have an aim that is fixed on virtue, because if you have that, then you're much less likely to be swayed, not just by your own passions, but by the uninformed conventions of the society that you're in. And so the reason Socrates is such a hero in my mind, philosophically, is because he was so steadfast to that commitment that, he walked willingly into his own death. I mean, that is the ultimate commitment, right? So,
bucking the trend, bucking convention all along the way, and not just saying that I'm not going to do it because society says so, I'm going to be an anti-establishment. That's not the point.
Right.
The point is, there are some things that are intrinsically good and society does approve of them, and one should participate in that.
Right.
And but majority of the things that we participate in, just because society says it's good, doesn't necessarily make it good. You have to go through the litmus test.
Yeah, and you could end up in very lonely places.
Yeah.
I mean, how often do you realize that you've ended up in a situation? I've ended up in situations where I didn't make the right decision because it would have felt too lonely. I would have been out on a limb. But there's been other situations where I did have the courage to say, no, this is what I'm going to do because this is the right thing to do. And you've actually end up in situations where you're unpopular, where you're in that lonely place. But in order to have the internal fortitude to even make those choices, you have to have some aim. And so this idea of virtue as the aim is very important. And this is what's very clearly illustrated here.
Correct. So what you're saying essentially is that one has to then understand the virtues, practice the virtues, and develop practical wisdom based on your trial and errors. And once you do that, then you can use your moral compass to influence you to make the right decision every time, as opposed to the easy way out is, what does society say I should do? And then what does this political ideology say I should do? And so that is, you are leaving the higher thinking to some other extrinsic faction or authority that basically tells you how to live, and you can be this lazy.
Yeah, you're outsourcing your rational thought to some organization,
and they say I'm going to do it because Fox News says do this, so I'm going to defer to them. They are the experts,
because, right? And how many times in history do we have examples of people who just sort of like completely outsourced the rational thinking and headed down these incredibly tragic paths, right?
That's right.
So there's no downside to inquiry. There's no downside to self-examination and the close examination and inspection of the decisions that you're going to make, especially if they're the big, important ones.
Correct. didn't mean to necessarily ding Fox News, but I mean mass media in general, right?
Yeah.
Because that's what happens. You end up watching. Just look at the whole mask mandate, vaccinations. How is it that there's a segment of society that thinks it's absolutely okay to get vaccinated? There's another segment that thinks it's absolutely not okay to get vaccinated. We are all the same human being. We have the same exact makeup, inside. We have the same ability to rationalize and think. So what is driving us to make these decisions?
Right.
These aren't our decisions.
Right.
These are decisions that are being made for us by a higher authority that we have just given away our rational thinking to and said, you do it for us, you tell us.
Yeah. And so that discussion has to be made cautiously, because the problem right now is that the aims of these discussions are polluted with
Political.
other aims. Like, if what you're doing is trying to sell advertising space and get as many viewers as possible, you'll say whatever it takes to say, whether it's controversial or inflammatory. But that's why it's important to have very sort of clear-headed civil discussions. If the ultimate aim is to do what is best based on the best available evidence and trying to figure out what the next best step is, if there's a discussion that is completely focused on that as the ultimate aim, you will have a rational discussion about why this should happen, why that should happen. But as soon as you bring in sort of over-politicized aims, or basically as soon as the aim deviates from rational discussions about, what should we be aiming at, as soon as you have competing aims that come in and sort of pollute that dialogue, it breaks down very rapidly. And I think this is something in some of the dialogues that I think Socrates himself was frustrated by. One of the dialogues that we're going to go into is apology. Yeah. And this whole idea of it's not explicitly explained this way, but he laments this idea that, people can say things and that you can just say whatever you want. Right. And the unexamined, the unexamined words, unexamined ideas that get thrown out there that have an intent of just sort of inflaming the populace and not really actually elaborating or clarifying the truth is problematic.
But again, one thing you have to also discuss here essentially is that there is culture and then there's counterculture, and then the counterculture becomes the culture. We think of Socrates as a hero. During his time, Socrates was thought to be as an irritant, as someone who was inflammatory, who actually was trying to topple the government. Now, that's the basis of free speech. We have to have all sorts of conversations, right, and we have to listen to all sorts of viewpoints. But we shouldn't be influenced by all viewpoints. We should listen to them. We should have an argument. We should all express our opinions. But then we should use our own rational thinking to decide which opinions actually matter, which are actually true, quote unquote, opinions. Right. And that is, every human being has to spend that time to digest the information, hear all these viewpoints. We are not allowing that in society currently. Currently, we are focused on only a certain stream of information that we like. That's what the social media has done. It filters, it funnels the information to you. So all you're hearing is one viewpoint. Right. And we don't want to listen to the other viewpoint to make the rational decision. We're being influenced.
So the reason Euthyphro matters in 2021 is because as soon as you put the source of the argument over the merits of the argument, you've lost.
That's right. If you put the coming back to the point, that's the point that the litmus test.
Is this what good? Socrates is saying, right?
Is this good because a higher authority, mass media, the news channel of your choice, or your uncle's
or
Twitter account,
institutional conventions, authoritative organizations?
Is it good because they are saying it's good, or is it intrinsically good? And I think it is incumbent on us to use this litmus test on everything that we're doing. Right. We should probably stop here because there's a little bit more to talk about.
Yeah, we'll
how
talk more.
He kind of gets there.
There's a lot more to discuss.
Yeah, on the Euthyphro as well. But what do you think? This is good?
Yeah, I think we can pause here and then pick it up.
Yeah, next time.
We'll leave it here.